It's time to huddle up, football fans, and welcome into the Hard Count Podcast, Episode 5. I want to thank you for joining me today. It's May 31st. That means it's almost summertime, the official start of summer, and perhaps more importantly, it means that football season is inching closer and closer day by day. So thank you again for joining me today on the Hard Count Podcast, Episode 5. Normally, I do 4 downs, 4 topics each show, but today I want to change things up just a little bit. You know, we're almost into June now, and we still have quite a few notable free agents on the board. Now, a lot of that is having to do with the fact of, the COVID-19 pandemic, and guys can't necessarily work out for other teams and can't necessarily show off what they can still do. But nonetheless, we've got some notable free agents still left on the board. We had a couple come off the board earlier this week, but we still have a lot of guys who are really, really talented players still available. So what I want to do today is I want to take you through my top 5 NFL free agents who are still available today. And I'll also give you a prediction, or at least my prediction, for where the best landing spot for each one of those guys would be. So I'll take you through my top 5. I'll also give a few honorable mentions at the end. But I also just want to say that we had a couple of guys, Joe Flacco and Carlos Hyde, come off the board earlier this week. Joe Flacco, the 35-year-old quarterback, finally finding a new home after several years as a Baltimore Raven and then a couple of forgettable seasons as a Denver Bronco, in fact. He's now going to New York, and he'll be the backup for Sam Darnold. Carlos Hyde, who actually had a really nice season, under the radar season as a Houston Texan last year, over 1,000 rushing yards. He's now going to take his talents across the country to Seattle, and he'll be a part of a pretty loaded backfield in Seattle, quite frankly, with him, Chris Carson, and Rashad Penny. So a couple of guys that came off the board earlier this week, but still quite a few notable names still out there to be claimed at some point. And we're going to get right into things today. We're going to start off with my number 5 free agent who's still available. That's Logan Ryan. Logan Ryan, last year as a Tennessee Titan, he actually played quite well. 4 interceptions last year after having no interceptions the prior 2 seasons. And of course, Logan Ryan started off as a New England Patriot, played quite well during his time as a New England Patriot. Had several successful seasons under Bill Belichick in New England. Ends up going to Tennessee. As I mentioned last year, 4 interceptions, including an interception in the wild card round of the playoffs. Of course, if you remember going back to the playoffs this past season, Logan Ryan was actually the guy who picked off that final pass from Tom Brady, from his former teammate in Foxborough. Took it to the house. It was only like a 9 or 10-yard interception return, but he took it to the house, and that was really what sealed the deal for the Titans in that game. They punched their ticket to the next round of the playoffs, where, of course, they went on to upset Baltimore after that. But Logan Ryan, if you want to include that postseason interception of Tom Brady, actually 5 interceptions in total last season. So Logan Ryan, this is a good corner right here. I think that Logan Ryan, he is 29 currently, so you're getting to that point where, of course, decline just because of his age, that will become a factor sooner rather than later. But I think that Logan Ryan is still a serviceable corner in this league. Again, 4 interceptions, 5 if you want to include the playoff interception of Tom Brady. Also had 4 sacks, so that's pretty interesting. 4 sacks from the corner position. I think that he's a pretty valuable corner. I'm kind of surprised that he hasn't been signed yet. I know there's been a couple of teams in the mix for him that have been rumored for Logan Ryan, including the New York Jets. I think also the Giants have been in the mix as well. So I think both of those teams would be pretty solid fits for Logan Ryan. I think that for me, if I had to give a prediction for Logan Ryan, or if I had to give a spot that I think would be really good for him, how about the Chicago Bears? When I look at the Chicago Bears, I think about this team 2 years ago, not last year, but 2 years ago, when they were in the playoffs, when they were the winners of the NFC North. They've, of course, got upset, I guess, kind of, sort of, by Philadelphia in the playoffs in the first round. Of course, that was the double doink game that all the Chicago Bears fans remember, and, of course, all NFL fans remember, really. Cody Parkey double doink off the upright and then off the goalpost, secure the win for Philadelphia in that game. But when I think about the Chicago Bears team from a couple of seasons ago, look, they got pressure on the opposing quarterbacks. They're very strong on their defensive line. They can get after you. They can create havoc for an opposing quarterback. But I look at this team defensively. Now, I won't even talk about their issues offensively. Mitch Trubisky, Nick Foles, we're going to see how that plays out. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to. My gut feeling says that I think Mitch Trubisky probably gets the nod to at least start the year. How long he will keep that starting gig remains to be seen. But when I look at this Bears team, I think that while I'm very confident in them, again, in terms of their defensive line and getting after opposing quarterbacks and generating some pressure on the quarterbacks in that division, whether it be Rodgers, Kirk Cousins, Matt Stafford, I worry about this team a little bit in the secondary. I don't know if I can fully trust their secondary right now. They went out and they got Artie Burns. I don't really know what to expect from Artie Burns. I don't expect too much from him. They also went out in the second round of the draft, got a corner Jalen Johnson from Utah. We'll see what he does. We don't know. He's a second round draft pick, so you certainly hope for the best, but we don't know exactly what he's going to bring to the table this season for the Chicago Bears. But I do think bolstering that secondary with a corner like Logan Ryan would be super beneficial for the Chicago Bears this season. And again, they're in a division with good quarterback play. Aaron Rodgers, don't even have to talk about him. We know what he is. Matt Stafford's going to be coming back from the back injury. He might start the season a little slow, but Matt Stafford, you look what he did last year before going down with that back injury. He was on a tear. So Matt Stafford's going to be tough to deal with. Aaron Rodgers is going to be tough to deal with. Kirk Cousins, he's the most slept-on quarterback in the NFL, because of his postseason struggles. So I think that this is a very tricky division in terms of the quarterback play that Chicago's going to have to face. So adding a corner such as Logan Ryan to bolster that secondary, I think would be huge for them. I think he'd be a great fit for them. Again, 5 interceptions last year, 4 sacks. He's 29. So I think he still has a couple good years left in the tank. He may not be a long-term investment for Chicago, but I do think, a 2, 3, maybe a 4-year contract, that might be pushing it. But a 2 or 3 year deal, I think is absolutely suitable for Logan Ryan. I think he'd be a very nice player for them to add. So he's number 5 on my list. Number 4 on my list, a guy who I'm pretty surprised has not been signed yet. And that's Everson Griffin formerly of the Minnesota Vikings now. Now, Everson Griffin, he's been in Minnesota his whole career. He's actually spent a decade as a Minnesota Viking since being drafted out of USC in 2010. And Everson Griffin, look, he's a guy who's dealt with some things off the field. He's dealt with some personal struggles that have sometimes gotten a little bit in the way of his football career. But I have to say, when he's been on the field, this guy has been absolutely incredible. Last season, even though he's 32 years old, 8 sacks a season ago, he actually had 1 interception as well. Finished with a PFF grade of 77.6. Now, I don't live and die by PFF. I'm not one of those people who just absolutely lives and dies by PFF grades. But that is a pretty solid grade, especially for a 32-year-old pass rusher. So I think that Everson Griffin, he's a guy, again, he might not be as destructive of a force as he was in his earlier days with the Vikings, and I certainly understand that a team is not going to commit multiple years to Everson Griffin at this stage of his career. He's lining himself up for most likely a 1-year deal from somebody. We just don't know who it's going to be yet, but a 1-year deal from somebody. But having said that, again, 8 sacks a year ago, this is a guy who can still generate some pressure on opposing quarterbacks. And, with a pass rusher like Everson Griffin, even though he's not young, you're still not going to be able to get, really talented pass rushers just anywhere. They don't just come along. We rarely see talented pass rushers, especially young ones, hit the market. So even when you're looking at a guy who may be 32, who may be on the decline of his career, you still have to look at a guy like that and recognize that he can still bring a lot to your football team. And I think that's what Everson Griffin, he can do for a team this year. So I think a great fit for Everson Griffin this season would be the Arizona Cardinals. That's the team who I think should go out and pursue Everson Griffin on a 1-year deal. Arizona, I look at what they've done this offseason. Been very impressed with their offseason. Of course, we know that their offense is going to be electrifying this year with DeAndre Hopkins being brought into the mix, Kyler Murray in year 2. You're still going to have Larry Fitzgerald, the ageless receiver, is still going to be there. You're going to have Christian Kirk there. Kenyon Drake, in his first full year as an Arizona Cardinal. So you know exactly what the Arizona Cardinal offense is going to bring to the table this year. But, their defense, we still don't know exactly what to expect. Now, I think they, of course, got very fortunate the fact that Isaiah Simmons out of Clemson was able to drop to them to number 9 in the draft. Now, that was an excellent pick, in my opinion. Love the fact that they went out and got Isaiah Simmons. But there are still some issues with their defense. I think one of the ways you can start addressing those issues on the defensive side of the ball for Arizona is by adding a talented pass rusher like Everson Griffin. Now, you also think about the quarterbacks who are in that division. You've got Russell Wilson. He's a guy who can run around the field. You're going to have to be able to generate some pressure on him. You've got young quarterbacks in that division, such as Jared Goff and Jimmy Garoppolo as well. You're going to have to be able to put those guys on the turf. So I think that Everson Griffin, he might not be a 12, 13, 14 sack type of player like he once was, but I think it's completely reasonable to think that he'll be able to give you 8 or 9 sacks this season. And he could be the type of player who could put Arizona a little bit over that hump and maybe secure them a 6 or 7 seed in the playoffs this upcoming season. Now for number 3 on my list, how about a guard, Larry Warford? This is a guy who was released a few weeks ago by the New Orleans Saints in an effort to free up some cap room. They're actually going to be able to save a little bit over $7 million this season by cutting Larry Warford. So Warford is a guy first joined the NFL in 2013 when he was drafted by the Detroit Lions. Had several successful seasons as a Detroit Lion, but ultimately decided to leave. He's now been with the New Orleans Saints for the past 3 years, and he's been a Pro Bowler all 3 seasons. He might not be the player that he was as a Lion. I wouldn't say that he's been quite as good as he was with Detroit, but Larry Warford, he's still been a Pro Bowler the past 3 seasons, and he's done quite well as a New Orleans Saint. I think the best fit for Larry Warford coming up this season would be the Minnesota Vikings. I'll go back to the NFC North. I think the Minnesota Vikings, when I look at this team, they need help on the offensive line, and there's not much doubt about it. Kirk Cousins is a guy, you look at him as a quarterback, I think he's a pretty good quarterback, but he's also not a guy who can run around the field. He's also not a guy who can evade a lot of pressure. I think you have to keep him well protected. So Larry Warford is a guard who could come in. He will immediately be a huge upgrade to Minnesota's offensive line, because Minnesota's offensive line last season was a huge liability for them. And, this offseason, they really haven't done a whole lot to go out and make drastic improvements to their offensive line. So I do think that Larry Warford, you bring him in at the guard position, I think that he would be a massive upgrade for Minnesota, what they have right now. I think that he would really help out their entire offense, honestly, because we know that Minnesota is a run-first team. They want to pound the ball with Dalvin Cook up the middle. And so I think Larry Warford would help in that run protection. I think that he would help in the pass protection as well, keeping Kirk Cousins upright, because Kirk Cousins is a quarterback who needs to be kept upright. He's not a guy, as I mentioned a minute ago, he's not a guy who's going to take off, run around the field, evade a lot of pressure, and make plays out of nowhere like a Deshaun Watson or a Russell Wilson. He's a guy who pretty much stands in the pocket, needs a clean pocket in order to deliver a strike to whatever receiver he's targeting. So Larry Warford, again, it's hard for me to give you any stats for him that's going to blow you away. He is an offensive lineman. I don't think you're exactly going to go ooh and ah if I tell you how many sacks he gave up last year, how many penalties he had last year. But he is a rock-solid guard. He's a little bit up there in age. He's in his 30s as well. But again, he wasn't a player being released by the New Orleans Saints for poor performance. That's not what it was about. It's about the fact that New Orleans was able to save quite a bit of money by cutting him. But again, he is a player who's been a Pro Bowler for the New Orleans Saints for the past 3 years. So we know that he's still a talented player. And again, Minnesota, you don't have to commit several years to Larry Warford. You can commit just a year or maybe 2 to him, but your offensive line is bad. You need a guard. You need actually several players on the offensive line who can come in and be upgrades to the guys you have right now. So I think that Minnesota, it would be a seamless fit for Warford to walk into there. He would provide some added protection to Kirk Cousins, keep him upright, keep him stable in the pocket. He would also help out Dalvin Cook in the running game as well. So I think that would be an excellent fit. It wouldn't be a flashy move. Larry Warford, he's a guard. He's not a receiver. He's not a running back, not a defensive end. It wouldn't be a flashy move for Minnesota, but it would be the right move if Minnesota hopes to contend this season and get over that hump and beat out Green Bay in the NFC North. Number 2 on my list, a guy that we don't have to talk about too much. We know the story. Cam Newton, again, is really the only quarterback, now that Joe Flacco is off the board going to the New York Jets. Cam Newton remains the only high-profile quarterback who is still on the free agent market even today. Again, don't want to go too much into Cam Newton's story. We know who he is. Former Auburn quarterback, former champion at Auburn, spent 9 years in Carolina, took him to a Super Bowl, won an MVP. But of course, the injuries, the age is catching up to Cam Newton, now being 31 years old. But I still think that Cam Newton, again, look, you might not want to bring him on as your starter because of the injury concerns, or maybe you just don't want to deal with Cam Newton and kind of the flash and the flare of Cam Newton on a week-to-week basis. I get that. I understand that. However, Cam Newton's a guy who deserves to be in the NFL right now. If Joe Flacco's getting signed a week ago, going to the Jets, Cam Newton deserves a spot somewhere. And so I would still contend that I think the best fit for Cam Newton is the Pittsburgh Steelers. I still believe that to be true. That's what I said on my show actually several weeks ago. But I still think that Cam Newton would be a great fit for Pittsburgh. And it's for a few different reasons. First of all, you don't have to worry about Cam Newton overtaking Big Ben as the starter. I think that's one of the big issues, the big concerns that some teams have regarding Cam Newton is that you don't want to bring Cam Newton in, with a quarterback who's kind of not really secure in his position as the starting quarterback. And then you have to start answering questions about, is Cam going to be the starter next week? If so-and-so keeps performing poorly, when will Cam get the opportunity to start? You don't want to deal with that. And so that's, I think, one of the biggest concerns from other teams. With Pittsburgh, you wouldn't have to deal with that. Big Ben's the guy. They're not going to replace Big Ben no matter what. No matter how poor he's performing, there's no way, not a chance in heck, they're replacing Big Ben. Unless he gets hurt. If he gets hurt, that's the other part of the equation. But I think that's something that would be very beneficial by having Cam Newton in Pittsburgh. Last season, the Pittsburgh defense did virtually all it could to keep the Steelers in the playoff race when Big Ben went down early in the season. They had Mason Rudolph come in. And he, for some fleeting moments, he looked okay. They also brought in Devlin Hodges or Duck Hodges. And he, again, for some fleeting moments, he looked okay. But ultimately, they both did not play nearly well enough in order to get the Steelers into the playoffs. And the only reason that the Steelers were close to making a playoff berth at the end of things was the fact that their defense was routinely keeping them in the game week after week after week. But one of the things you look for in a backup quarterback, you're not necessarily looking for your backup quarterback to be as good as the starter. That's not the point. That's not the point of a backup quarterback. But what you're looking for in a backup quarterback is a guy who, if called upon, if he needs to come in for an injury or some other reason, a guy who will not lose you games. A guy who doesn't necessarily have to win you every single game, but a guy who will not lose you games. He will not make stupid, boneheaded decisions at the quarterback position to lose you games. And we see that too often with backup quarterbacks who come in, they try to do too much. They try to do exactly what the starter was doing, and it never works out. They end up making boneheaded decisions, turnovers, bad throws, poor timing, all of the above. And that's the reason why a lot of teams, once their starter goes down and their backup comes in, the season is over. And you don't want your season to be over automatically when your starter goes down. And I think that's really the huge benefit of Cam Newton is you bring him in if you're the Steelers. Big Ben, he's a guy like Cam Newton who has injury concerns. He has age concerns, in fact. So if Big Ben were to go down once again, you'd have Cam Newton stepping in, a guy who is not going to lose you the game. And not only will he not lose you the game, he's actually a backup quarterback who can win you a lot of games. Most backup quarterbacks, they might not lose you the game, but they can't necessarily win you games all on their own either. But Cam Newton, we know, is a guy who absolutely can do that. He's done that for so many seasons. He's won an MVP. And so I still think that Pittsburgh and Cam Newton would be the closest thing to a perfect marriage that there is right now currently for him and for his situation. And then finally, number one on my list is Jadeveon Clowney. Clowney is the former number one pick of the Houston Texans, spent several seasons in Houston, playing alongside J.J. Watt as well, but is coming off his first season as a Seattle Seahawk. And maybe the stats don't necessarily blow you away. He only had 3 sacks last year for Seattle, but he also did have 4 forced fumbles, which is quite amazing. And he had a PFF grade. And again, I mentioned earlier in the show today, I don't live and die by PFF. I don't think it's the perfect resource. I don't think it's always 100% entirely accurate. But I do think it's still quite interesting to see how players are graded. And because I think that there are moments and times where, maybe in the stat sheet, a player, in the box score, the player is not putting up the highest number tallies, but he's actually performing quite well if you look into the tape, you look into the data. And I think that's really the case with Jadeveon Clowney, is that even though he only had 3 sacks a season ago, he was still really good in run support for Seattle. He did force those 4 fumbles, and he had a PFF grade of 87.3, which is pretty darn close to being elite. That's really, really good. When you're anything that's in the 80s, that's a really, really good PFF grade. So I think that Jadeveon Clowney, he's still one of the most disruptive forces on the defensive front for any team. So I think that there's actually quite a few teams, and it was hard to pick just one. There's actually quite a few teams who should be in the mix for Jadeveon Clowney, who should be targeting him, as long as it's at the right price. You don't want to give him the $20 million that he was necessarily asking for at the beginning of free agency. But as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago on my podcast, if you get Jadeveon Clowney somewhere in that 13 to 15, maybe 16 mil a year range, he's a guy you want on your football team. And so I think, and I talked about it back then, but I really think the 2 best fits for this guy are the New York Jets and the New York Giants. I think both the New York teams would be excellent fits for Jadeveon Clowney. He would come in and immediately be a disruptor. I talked about Everson Griffin already. He's a little bit older than Clowney. He can still be a disruptive force. He'll get you 7, 8, 9 sacks this year, probably, I think is reasonable to expect. Jadeveon Clowney, he might be around the same number of sacks, but I also think he'll generate more pressure on the quarterback. I also think he'll be better in run support. He knows how to pop the football out. Again, 4 forced fumbles a year ago. So Jadeveon Clowney is still an absolute monster on the defensive side of the football. And I think both the Giants and the Jets, these are 2 teams, they've both had pretty decent off seasons. I think that both the Giants and the Jets, there's still several pieces away from being a top contender. Neither team is, anywhere close to a Super Bowl contender. I do think there is the possibility, of these teams maybe surprising a lot of people and making a push for the playoffs. But nonetheless, there's still a few pieces away. But I do think that adding Jadeveon Clowney would go a long way for either side in possibly making that playoff push and getting into the playoffs and surprising a lot of people around the NFL. So Jadeveon Clowney, again, you got to get him somewhere in that $13 to $15 million range. I can't be giving him $20 million a year. I just don't think that he's at quite that level. He's not at that elite pass rusher level. That's the level, that's the amount of money that you're giving the top 4, top 5 pass rushers in the NFL. I don't see Clowney as necessarily being that type of player, but I do think that Jadeveon Clowney is still one of the most disruptive forces in the NFL today on the defensive side of the football. The PFF grade speaks for itself. Again, maybe he doesn't have the insane sack total that some other pass rushers have, only 3 sacks, but an 87.3 PFF grade, that's still one of the better grades in the NFL, in fact. So I do think, as long as you can get him at a reasonable price, and Clowney's not an old player either. He's not into his 30s yet. So I think that as long as that you get Jadeveon Clowney at a somewhat reasonable price, he would be an absolute home run for any team this offseason. But I do think the Jets and the Giants, 2 teams heading in the right direction, but they need at least one, but probably a couple, but at least one really game-changing piece on the defensive side of things. Jadeveon Clowney would be an absolute home run for either of those teams. And then lastly, some honorable mentions. Who just missed the cut on my top free agent list? I gave you my top 5 free agents who are still on the board, but who just barely missed the cut? A few guys who I really like. Darqueze Dennard, formerly of the Cincinnati Bengals. Kelvin Beachum, who last played for the New York Jets. Devontae Freeman, we know him, Atlanta Falcons. Damon Snacks Harrison, I'm sure you all know him by Snacks. And then Jason Peters, the offensive lineman, formerly of the Philadelphia Eagles. who is still going strong at the age of 38 years old, but still looking for an opportunity for this upcoming season in the NFL. Those are 5 guys who I believe, if I were to expand my list from the top 5 free agents still available to the top 10, those are probably the 5 guys who I would add to my list. Again, Darqueze Dennard, Kelvin Beachum, Devonta Freeman, Damon Snacks Harrison, and Jason Peters as well. So those are some notable names, very notable names, who are still on the free agency board as we enter the month of June. We're going to see how it plays out. We're going to see if some of these guys start coming off the board soon here. Again, Carlos Hyde, Joe Flacco, those are probably 2 of the most high-profile free agents who have recently come off the board. But many, many top-tier free agents still available, guys who can make quite a big difference for any team they go to this coming year. So it's going to be very interesting to keep your eyes on as we go into the summer months and as we inch closer and closer to the start of the NFL season. So that's going to do it for me today on the Hard Count Podcast. I want to thank you again for listening today. Next week is going to be episode 6 of the Hard Count Podcast. Hopefully I'll be able to get another special guest of mine on the show in order to add a little bit more fun and a little bit of an extra layer to the show for the next time we do things. But again, thank you for listening today. I will see you next time from the Gridiron. It'll be the Hard Count Podcast, episode 6. So take care, and I'll see you later.